I understand from listening to people across the Commonwealth how the most painful aspects of our past continue to resonate. King Charles noticed the unusual meetings, the whispered phone calls, the documents Camilla quickly hid when he entered the room. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Queen Camilla had been secretly negotiating to sell a royal estate behind his back. The king's trusted aides uncovered the stunning plot just in time. His Majesty felt utterly betrayed. Sources close to the situation disclosed Charles acted immediately, stripping Camilla of significant royal powers in a bold assertion of his authority. The woman he'd waited decades to marry had deceived him in the most shocking way. But why would the Queen risk everything for this secret sale? The Queen's secret plan. Queen Camilla had once been the most despised woman in all of Britain. The hatred had been visceral, relentless, a tidal wave of public fury that threatened to drown her completely. Newspapers branded her a home wrecker, a woman without conscience who had destroyed a fairy tale marriage. Strangers shouted ugly words at her in the street. Protesters held signs declaring she would never be their queen. On this particular evening, she stood alone by the tall windows of Clarence House, watching rain streak down the glass and delicate rivers London spread out before her, gray and endless, the city, lights blurring into watercolor smudges through the downpour. Her hands rested gently on the window frame, fingers trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what she carried inside. Her mind circled the same thought over and over, like a bird trapped in a cage: the estate, the sale, the secret she had been keeping from Charles. The property in question was an old countryside manor that once belonged to the late Queen Mother. It sat on acres of rolling green hills, surrounded by ancient oak trees and stone walls covered in ivy. Beautiful, yes, but also abandoned empty rooms collected dust. Gardens grew wild without care. The cost of maintaining such a place had become absurd, draining resources that could be used elsewhere. Camilla told herself she was being practical. She was making a sensible choice. Charles would understand eventually he had to. But practicality was only part of the truth. For years, Camilla had stood beside her husband as he carried the monarchy on his shoulders. She watched him make decisions about estates, finances, public appearances, and family matters. She offered advice when asked, comfort when wanted, and support without question. Yet she had never truly held power of her own. Every choice, every signature, every direction came from him. She was his partner, yes, but not his equal in authority, and somewhere along the way, that silence had begun to ache. This sale represented something more than money or property. It was her chance to prove she could act with strength and independence. It was her way of saying she mattered beyond being someone's wife. She wanted to reshape her role to carve out space where her voice carried weight without needing permission first. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was desperation. Either way, she had made up her mind. The calls began in secret. Quiet conversations held in private rooms with doors closed and voices low. Lawyers were consulted. Valuations were requested. Documents were prepared and signed with her elegant handwriting. Documents that bore her name alone without Charles knowing they existed. She moved carefully, ensuring every step remained hidden from him. She told herself it was for his own good, that she would explain everything once it was done. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was afraid he would stop her, afraid he would dismiss her reasons, afraid she would remain invisible forever if she did not act. Now royal staff began to notice. Whispers spread through corridors like smoke under doorways. A longtime butler, a man who had served the family for decades and knew the rhythms of palace life better than anyone, started piecing together fragments of conversation. He saw the tension in Camilla's posture during breakfast. He noticed the closed meetings with unfamiliar faces. And then, one afternoon, while organizing papers in her study, he glimpsed a document partially hidden beneath a stack of correspondence. His trained eye caught her signature at the bottom before she swept into the room and quickly gathered everything away. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The queen was keeping something from the king. Days passed. The sale moved forward in the shadows. Camilla finalized agreements with buyers who asked no questions and demanded discretion. Money would change hands soon. The estate would belong to someone else, and she would have made it happen entirely on her own terms. She stood by the window again that evening, watching rain continue its endless dance across glass. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman who looked composed on the surface, but carried turmoil underneath. She thought about Charles, probably working late in another part of the house, reviewing papers and fulfilling duties as he always did. Would he feel betrayed when he learned what she had done? Would he understand her need to matter, to contribute beyond smiles and public appearances? Or would this crack something between them that could never be fully repaired? Her heart pounded as she sealed the final documents. Her hand shook as she placed them in an envelope. The deal was done. There was no turning back now, but somewhere in the quiet palace halls, that same butler was speaking softly to someone he trusted. Information was beginning to move. Concern was growing, and time was running out before the truth could no longer be contained. As Camilla sealed the deal in secret, one question rose in the quiet palace halls. What happens when the king finds out? A king confronts the unthinkable. King Charles Roman III was a man who carried gentleness like a quiet flame. Those fortunate enough to know him beyond the ceremonial robes and formal speeches understood that beneath the crown lived someone profoundly human. He had a painter's soul, finding solace in watercolors that captured Scottish landscapes during early morning hours when the world still slept. Books were his constant companions. Philosophy, history, poetry stacked in careful towers throughout his private spaces. He spoke to his plants as if they were old friends, believing they responded to kindness. His laughter, when it came, was genuine and unguarded, though it appeared less frequently as the years pressed heavier upon his shoulders. Staff members cherished his thoughtfulness, the way he remembered small details about their lives and asked follow-up questions that proved he actually listened. And through everything, the criticism, the scrutiny, the impossible expectations, Camilla had been his constant. She was the person who understood him when the rest of the world seemed determined to misunderstand. She was his peace in chaos, his clarity and confusion. Loving her had become as natural as breathing. But lately, something felt wrong. He sat in his private study at Balmoral on a cold afternoon, rain drumming steadily against window panes that framed views of mountains disappearing into mist. The room smelled of old leather and wood polish, familiar scents that usually brought comfort. Today, they offered none. His desk overflowed with correspondence and official documents requiring attention, but his mind refused to settle on any single task. Instead, his thoughts circled endlessly around observations he wished he could ignore. Camilla had been pulling away, not dramatically or suddenly, but in incremental movements so subtle he almost convinced himself he was imagining them. She had begun missing certain royal meetings, offering vague explanations that never quite satisfied his questions. When his schedule included important discussions about estate management or financial planning, She found reasons to be elsewhere. Phone calls arrived frequently now, and she would excuse herself to take them in private rooms with closed doors. Once he had walked into the drawing room to find her speaking urgently with someone, her voice low and intense. The moment she noticed him, her expression shifted, became carefully pleasant, and the conversation ended abruptly. "Everything all right?" he had asked, searching her face for truth. "Of course, darling." "Just palace business," she replied, kissing his cheek before moving past him, leaving him standing alone with unanswered questions hanging in the air like smoke. He wanted desperately to believe her. Trust had always been the foundation of their relationship, built painstakingly over years of weathering storms together, but foundation stones, he was learning, could crack under enough pressure. Documents began disappearing from files he knew should be complete. Financial reports arrived on his desk with sections that seemed deliberately vague. Numbers that raised questions nobody could adequately answer. He noticed how conversations among staff would halt mid-sentence when he entered certain rooms, replaced by uncomfortable silences and shifting eyes that avoided his gaze. These were not the normal rhythms of palace life. Something was happening just beyond his view, hidden deliberately from him. Late one evening, unable to sleep, he found himself thinking about his mother. Queen Elizabeth had ruled with steel wrapped in velvet. Her sense of duty, so absolute it sometimes felt inhuman, but she had understood something fundamental about monarchy. It could not survive secrets, transparency within the crown, honesty among those who served it. These were non-negotiable principles. She would never have tolerated whispered meetings or hidden agendas. She would have confronted any suspicion immediately, cleanly, without hesitation. Charles was not his mother. He preferred patience over confrontation, understanding over accusation, but even patience has limits. During a routine meeting with his private secretary, he made his decision. The man stood before him reviewing schedules, his manner professional and efficient as always. Charles interrupted him mid-sentence. "I need you to conduct a thorough review of the estate files," he said quietly, keeping his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. "All of them, particularly anything related to property management and sales." His secretary paused, understanding immediately that this was not a casual request. "Of course, Your Majesty, may I ask, what specifically concerns you?" Charles looked toward the window, watching rain trace patterns down glass. "I'm not certain yet, perhaps nothing, but I need to know." The secretary nodded and departed, leaving Charles alone with thoughts that felt increasingly like burdens he could barely carry. He had survived so much already. The press had crucified him during his divorce, painting him as villain in a story far more complicated than headlines suggested. Public opinion had questioned whether he deserved to become king, whether his mistakes disqualified him from the throne. Family scandals had erupted repeatedly, his son's troubled relationships, relatives whose behavior embarrassed the institution he represented. Through all of it, Camilla had stood beside him. She had been his defender when others attacked, his comfort when criticism cut deepest, his reminder that he was more than the sum of his failures. But this felt different. External attacks were battles he knew how to fight. Betrayal from within, from the person he trusted most completely, was something else entirely. It felt like the ground beneath him was becoming unstable, like gravity itself might fail. 3 days later, his secretary returned. The folder he carried seemed thin, almost insignificant, but the expression on his face told Charles everything before a single word was spoken. "This was not good news, Your Majesty." The secretary began carefully. I believe you should see this." He placed the folder on Charles's desk and stepped back, hands clasped, waiting. Charles stared at the brown folder for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. His heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth had gone dry. Finally, with fingers that felt numb, he opened it. Inside was an estate sale proposal. Legal language filled the pages, technical terms, and financial projections that his mind struggled to process. He forced himself to read slowly, carefully until he reached the signature line at the bottom of the document. There in handwriting he would recognize anywhere was Camilla's signature. The room seemed to tilt. His hand began to tremble, making the paper shake as though caught in the wind. She had signed an agreement to sell royal property without telling him, without asking his permission, without even hinting that such a decision was being considered. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "We believe negotiations have been ongoing for approximately 6 weeks, sir." 6 weeks. While he worried about her distance, he questioned his own instincts. While he tried to trust her despite growing doubts, she had been actively planning this in secret. Behind his back, Charles carefully set the document down, afraid he might tear it if he held it any longer. He looked up at his secretary, who waited with sympathetic silence. "Has she sold it already? The sale appears imminent, but not yet finalized." When the first proof landed before him, Camilla's signature on a sale proposal, the king's hand trembled. Has the queen gone too far? When loyalty demands sacrifice, Sir Andrew Hall had spent his entire adult life in service to the crown, and it showed in everything about him. He was a man of precision and quiet dignity, the sword who ironed his own shirts to perfection and polished his shoes until they gleamed like mirrors. His silver hair was always neatly combed, his posture impeccable, even after long days that stretched into exhausting nights. Those who worked alongside him spoke of his fairness, how he never raised his voice, yet commanded respect through sheer competence and integrity. He had a gentle way with younger staff members, offering guidance without condescension, remembering their names and asking about their studies or families with genuine care. There was a warmth beneath his professional exterior, a kindness that made people trust him instinctively. He loved classical music and would sometimes hum Beethoven while reviewing documents in his office. On rare free evenings, he tended a small garden behind his cottage, finding peace among roses that bloomed under his patient attention. Above all else, he believed in duty, not the cold, rigid kind that crushed humanity, but the sacred responsibility to serve something greater than himself. The monarchy was not just his job. It was his calling, his purpose, the North Star by which he navigated every decision, which made what he had discovered so utterly devastating. It began innocuously enough. The king had requested a routine review of estate files, mentioning certain irregularities that troubled him. Sir Andrew had approached the task methodically, as he did everything, expecting to find minor administrative errors or overlooked paperwork. Instead, what emerged from those dusty folders felt like a crack spreading across ice that everyone assumed was solid. Queen Camilla had arranged meetings with private buyers, multiple meetings, detailed negotiations regarding the sale of a royal estate that belonged to the crown, not to her personally. Documents bore her signature authorizing discussions that should never have occurred without the king's explicit knowledge and consent. Phone records showed calls to solicitors and real estate consultants. Financial projections had been prepared. Terms had been discussed and nearly finalized, all of it done in absolute secrecy. Sir Andrew sat alone in his office late one evening. The incriminating papers spread across his desk like accusations waiting to be voiced. His hands trembled slightly as he studied each page again, hoping desperately to find some explanation that would make this acceptable, some detail that would transform betrayal into misunderstanding, but no such explanation existed. The evidence was clear and damning. He faced an impossible choice that felt like standing at a crossroads where every path led to destruction. On one hand, Queen Camilla had become someone he genuinely respected during her years in the royal family. She had handled enormous public pressure with grace, supported the king through difficult transitions, and earned her place through perseverance that many would have abandoned. Protecting her secret felt like loyalty to someone who had proven herself worthy of protection. Perhaps she had good reasons for what she was doing. Perhaps revealing this would cause unnecessary harm. On the other hand, his primary duty was to the king and to the institution of monarchy itself. Charles deserved to know what was happening behind his back. The crown could not function if those closest to power operated in shadows, making decisions that violated protocol and trust. If this sale proceeded and later became public knowledge, the scandal would be catastrophic. The press would tear them apart. Public confidence in the monarchy, already fragile, might shatter completely. Sir Andrew removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. He thought about all the years he had served, all the difficult moments when he had been mandated to deliver unwelcome news to people he cared about. This was different. This was not simply bad news. This was a bomb that would explode relationships and possibly destroy what remained of the king's ability to trust anyone. He remembered a conversation he had once had with the late Queen Elizabeth. She had told him something he never forgot. The hardest part of service is not the long hours or the criticism. It is doing the right thing when the right thing breaks your heart. Those words echoed in his mind now as he carefully gathered the documents and placed them in a plain folder. His heart did feel like it was breaking. He knew what this revelation would do to Charles. He knew the pain it would cause, but he also knew that silence would be a different kind of betrayal, not to the king, but to everything the monarchy was supposed to represent. The next evening, he requested a private audience with His Majesty. The king received him in his study at Balmoral, surrounded by books and photographs that spoke of a life lived under constant scrutiny. Charles looked tired, older somehow than he had seemed just weeks ago. The weight of the crown showed in lines around his eyes, and the way his shoulders curved forward slightly, as though carrying something too heavy. "You have news?" Charles asked quietly, gesturing for Sir Andrew to sit. "I do, Your Majesty." His voice caught slightly. He cleared his throat and continued, "I have completed the review you requested." He placed the folder on the desk between them. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Charles reached forward and opened it, beginning to read with an expression that started neutral and slowly transformed into something harder, colder, more terrible than anger. Sir Andrew watched the king's face as comprehension settled like winter frost. He saw the exact moment when understanding became real. When the words on those pages translated into emotional truth that could not be denied or explained away. Charles's jaw tightened. His breathing changed. One hand curled into a fist while the other held the paper with fingers that had gone white at the knuckles. The silence in the study became oppressive, thick with unspoken devastation. Rain continued its endless percussion against windows. A clock on the mantel ticked away seconds that felt like small eternities. Sir Andrew remained motionless, barely breathing, giving his king space to process what could not be unprocessed. Finally, after what might have been 5 minutes or 50, Charles closed the folder with careful precision. He placed both hands flat on the desk and stared at them as though they belonged to someone else. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes storms or earthquakes. "How long have you known?" "3 days, Your Majesty. I came to you immediately upon confirmation." Charles nodded slowly, still not looking up. "Thank you for your honesty, Andrew. I know this could not have been easy." "No, sir, it was not." Another long silence stretched between them. Then Charles raised his eyes, and Sir Andrew saw something in them that made his chest constrict with sorrow. Not rage, not even betrayal exactly, just profound bone-deep hurt that no position or protocol could protect against. "Leave me, please," the king said softly. Sir Andrew rose, bowed slightly, and walked toward the door. Just before exiting, he heard Charles speak again, almost to himself, words barely audible, but carrying the weight of kingdoms. "She wore my crown." As Charles closed the folder, his voice was quiet, too quiet. What punishment fits a betrayal from the woman who wears his crown? A marriage torn between duty and betrayal. King Charles Roman III's devotion to Camilla had been absolute, unwavering through years when the world told him to abandon her, to choose duty over love, to sacrifice his happiness for appearances he had refused. She had become not just his wife, but his partner in every sense, the person he turned to when darkness felt overwhelming, the voice that reminded him he was more than his mistakes. Their love had survived storms that would have destroyed weaker bonds, or so he had believed. Now he stood alone in his private chamber, staring into flames that danced and flickered in the stone fireplace before him. The documents lay on a nearby table, their presence feeling like poison seeping into the air he breathed. He had read them so many times the words had burned themselves into his memory. Every signature, every date, every meeting arranged without his knowledge. All of it proof that the person he trusted most had chosen deception over honesty. He had summoned her here. The message had been delivered through formal channels, not with the casual warmth they usually shared. She would understand from that alone that something had changed, that the ground beneath them was no longer stable. Minutes passed like hours. Then he heard footsteps approaching down the corridor, familiar steps he had learned to recognize over countless years together. The door opened slowly, and Camilla entered. She looked beautiful as always, composed and elegant in a way that had become second nature to her. But he could see uncertainty in her eyes, a weariness that had not been there before. She began to speak, perhaps to greet him or ask what this was about, but he raised one hand to stop her. The gesture was not aggressive, but unmistakably final. She fell silent, watching him with growing apprehension. The silence that followed felt physical, like a wall being constructed brick by brick between them. Charles could not find words that felt adequate to the moment. How did you begin a conversation about betrayal with a person who was supposed to be incapable of betraying you? How did you voice the pain of discovering that your anchor had been drifting away while you believed it held firm? Finally, he picked up the folder and held it toward her without looking at her face. His voice, when it came, was quiet and strained. "Tell me what this is." Camilla took the folder with hands that trembled slightly. She opened it, and he watched her expression shift as she recognized what she was seeing. Color drained from her cheeks. For a moment, she looked as though she might deny everything, but then something in her seemed to collapse. She closed the folder carefully and set it down. "Charles, I can explain." "Can you?" The words came out sharper than he intended, edged with pain he could not suppress. "Because I have been trying to understand this for days, and I cannot find any explanation that makes sense of why my wife would negotiate the sale of crown property behind my back. It was not like that, she said, her voice gaining strength as she tried to defend herself. I was trying to help. The estate has become a financial burden, draining resources we desperately need elsewhere. I thought if I could handle this quietly, efficiently, it would be one less problem for you to worry about. One less problem. Charles turned to face her fully now, and she took an involuntary step backward at what she saw in his eyes. You thought lying to me would be helpful, making decisions about property that belongs to the crown, not to you personally, without my knowledge or consent, would somehow ease my burden. I was not lying. I was simply, what were you doing, Camilla? His voice rose despite his efforts to control it. Years of suppressed emotions suddenly demanding release. You held secret meetings. You consulted lawyers and buyers. You signed documents authorizing negotiations that should never have occurred, all while looking me in the eye every single day and saying nothing. Tears formed in her eyes, but she held her ground. I wanted to prove I could be useful, that I could make difficult decisions and handle important matters. I am Queen Charles. I am not just some decoration standing beside you for photographs. No one has ever treated you that way, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I have always valued you, always sought your counsel, always made you my partner in everything. But partnership requires honesty. It requires trust, and you have destroyed that. The words hung between them like shattered glass. Camilla's composure finally cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks. I never meant to hurt you. She whispered, I thought I was doing the right thing, the right thing. Charles's laugh was bitter and hollow. My mother devoted her entire life to this institution. She understood that the crown requires absolute integrity, that those who serve it must place duty above personal ambition. You have dishonored everything she stood for. You have dishonored your position, the trust placed in you, and his voice broke completely. And you have dishonored us. Please, Charles, do not do this. We can work through this together. We have survived so much worse. But he was shaking his head, his face hardening into an expression she had never seen before. This was not her husband standing before her. Now this was the king, and the king had been betrayed by his queen. You will no longer have authority to make decisions regarding crown estates or finances, he said formally, each word falling like a judge's gavel. Any future involvement in royal business will require explicit approval. This is not negotiable. Camilla stood frozen, the full weight of what was happening finally hitting her. She had wanted power, wanted to matter, wanted to prove herself capable. Instead, she had lost the one thing that mattered most, his trust. Charles, please leave me, he said quietly, turning back toward the fireplace. I cannot look at you right now. She stood there for one more moment, perhaps hoping he would turn around, would soften, would give some sign that forgiveness might eventually be possible. But he remained facing the fire, his back rigid with pain and disappointment. Camilla walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing through the chamber like drum beats announcing an execution. She paused at the threshold, looking back one final time at the man she loved, the man she had wounded so deeply, but he did not turn. He did not call her back. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like finality. In the heavy stillness that followed, one question haunted both. Can a marriage survive when the crown becomes a weapon? From villain to victim, the changes began so quietly she almost missed them. At first, a charity engagement was removed from her schedule without proper explanation. Her private secretary mentioned something vague about timing conflicts, but the excuse felt thin, unconvincing. Within weeks, her calendar had emptied significantly. Events she had been preparing for suddenly included other royals. Instead, her name quietly erased from guest lists and official programs. Royal meetings that once included her now happened behind doors. She was not invited through advisors who had previously valued her perspective began bypassing her entirely, taking their questions and proposals directly to Charles as though she had ceased to exist in any meaningful capacity. She tried attending one such meeting uninvited, only to encounter uncomfortable silence and barely disguised relief when she excused herself early. Nobody said she was unwelcome. They did not need to. The message was clear. In every averted eye and forced smile, internal memos about estate management no longer bore her name. Financial reports she used to review never reached her desk anymore. She had been systematically removed from every aspect of royal decision, making with surgical efficiency. Her influence extracted like a tumor that threatened the health of the institution. The isolation cut deeper than any formal punishment could have managed. Staff members she had known for years now hurried past her in corridors, offering brief nods instead of the warm greetings they once shared. Conversations stopped when she approached, replaced by suffocating silences that screamed louder than accusations. Even her most trusted lady-in-waiting seemed distant now, choosing words with excessive care as though one wrong phrase might trigger some invisible crisis. The palace itself felt transformed. Hallways where she had once walked confidently now seemed hostile, every footstep echoing with loneliness. Rooms that had felt like home became foreign spaces where she no longer belonged. She found herself avoiding entire wings of the building, taking longer routes to avoid areas where she might encounter Charles or other family members. The prospect of those awkward, painful exchanges felt unbearable. Evenings stretched endlessly. She sat alone in her private sitting room, a book lying forgotten in her lap, tea growing cold and delicate china she no longer bothered to lift. The silence pressed against her from every direction, suffocating in its completeness. She thought about reaching out to friends, seeking comfort in familiar voices, but pride prevented her. How could she explain what she had done? How could she make anyone understand the desperation that had driven such foolish choices? In those solitary hours, reflection became inescapable. Her mind wandered backward through years of struggle and survival, retracing the path that had brought her to this devastating moment. She remembered the early days when loving Charles meant accepting hatred from millions who would never forgive her. She remembered standing beside him during his divorce, knowing the world blamed her for every tear his ex-wife shed, carrying that blame like chains wrapped around her chest. She remembered the slow, agonizing process of rebuilding her reputation through tireless work and genuine dedication. She remembered speaking at literacy events, visiting animal shelters, supporting causes that mattered deeply to her, all while cameras captured every moment. Looking for mistakes to criticize, she remembered the first time someone in a crowd smiled at her instead of scowling, how that small gesture had nearly broken her with relief. She remembered her wedding day, finally becoming Charles's wife legally and publicly, feeling like decades of suffering had finally led somewhere meaningful. She remembered being crowned queen consort, then simply queen, standing beside the man she loved while wearing symbols of acceptance she had never imagined possible. And she remembered recent years trying to carve out meaningful purpose within an institution never designed to accommodate someone with her history. She had wanted to contribute to matter beyond ceremonial appearances and carefully staged photographs. That desire had not been unreasonable or selfish. She had simply wanted to feel valuable, necessary, important in ways that went beyond her relationship with Charles. But somewhere that reasonable desire had twisted into desperation. Her need to prove herself had become toxic, driving her towards secrecy and deception that betrayed everything she claimed to value. She had convinced herself that results would justify methods that Charles would understand once he saw what she had accomplished. She had been catastrophically wrong. One gray afternoon, she stood at a window overlooking the royal gardens she had once adored. Roses bloomed in magnificent profusion, their colors vivid against perfectly maintained lawns. She had spent countless peaceful hours walking those paths, sometimes alone, but often with Charles, talking about everything and nothing, simply enjoying companionship that mandated no performance or pretense. Those walks felt impossibly distant now, like memories belonging to someone else entirely. She pressed her palm flat against cool glass, exhaustion washing through her in relentless waves. Charles remained buried in official duties, accepting every engagement offered, traveling constantly, filling every moment with work that prevented conversations they desperately wanted. She understood what he was doing. He was hiding from her from the pain of confronting what she had shattered between them. The irony was brutal. She had acted secretly because she wanted recognition and authority. Now she possessed neither. She was queen in title alone, stripped of influence and isolated from the one person whose opinion had ever truly mattered to her. As Camilla looked out at the royal gardens she once adored, she whispered to herself, "Is this the price of power or the cost of losing love?" The crown's cruel lesson. King Charles Roman III found solace in gardens where he could lose himself among growing things that did not judge or demand. He painted watercolors on Sunday mornings, trying to capture moments of light and shadow that moved him. He wrote letters by hand because he believed words on paper carried weight that digital messages never could. Music brought him to tears. Certain symphonies, particular pieces of poetry, stories about ordinary people showing extraordinary courage. He was sentimental in ways that embarrassed him, keeping ticket stubs from meaningful evenings and pressing flowers from significant occasions into books where they would remain preserved above everything else. He loved with an intensity that had shaped his entire life for better and worse. Camilla had been his great love, the relationship he had fought the world to keep, the person who made him feel seen and understood when everyone else only saw the prince, then the king. That love had sustained him through unimaginable criticism and personal heartbreak. Now it felt like a wound that would not heal. Days passed in suffocating silence. He buried himself in official duties with single-minded determination, accepting every engagement offered, traveling constantly, filling each moment so completely that exhaustion became his only companion. Meetings stretched late into evenings, documents piled endlessly on his desk. He worked through meals, reviewed reports during what should have been rest periods, and found himself staring at paperwork at 3:00 in the morning. Because sleep would not come, but the work could not fill the emptiness. The crown sat heavier on his head now, a physical weight that made his neck ache and his temples throb. He had always understood that kingship mandated sacrifice. His mother had taught him that lesson from childhood, but he had imagined those sacrifices would involve public opinion, personal freedom, privacy. He had never imagined the throne would demand he sacrifice the one relationship that made bearing its weight possible. Power, he was learning, could command respect, but never deliver peace. He could issue orders that move nations, make decisions affecting millions of lives, yet he could not solve the crisis happening inside his own heart. The irony was not lost on him. One morning, driven by something he could not name, he traveled to the estate that had caused this terrible rift. The drive took hours through countryside that blurred past his window like watercolors running together in rain. His security detail followed at a discreet distance as he walked through empty rooms filled with furniture draped in white cloth like ghosts waiting to be remembered. The house was beautiful in the way old things often are, full of history and stories built by hands long turned to dust. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, creating patterns on wooden floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. He moved slowly through corridors, touching walls and door frames, feeling the weight of time pressing against him from all sides. This place had belonged to his grandmother, the Queen Mother. She had loved it dearly, hosting family gatherings and quiet weekends away from London's intensity. He remembered visiting as a child, running through these very hallways while she laughed, and called after him to slow down. Those memories felt impossibly distant now, like scenes from someone else's life. He stood in what had been her favorite sitting room, where afternoon light had always been perfect for reading. His mother's words echoed in his memory, advice she had given him shortly after he became king. Duty requires sacrifice, she had told him, her voice gentle but firm. The throne will ask things of you that break your heart. You must give them anyway, because that is what it means to serve. At the time, he had nodded solemnly, believing he understood. Now standing in this empty room, surrounded by ghosts of happier times, he finally grasped what she had meant. The crown demanded everything, not just public sacrifice, but private suffering, not just political compromise, but personal loss. It took and took and took, never satisfied, never offering relief. He thought about Camilla, probably sitting alone in some distant room of the palace, carrying her own pain and isolation. He thought about the weeks of silence between them, the careful avoidance, the way they moved through shared spaces like strangers afraid to acknowledge each other's existence. He thought about what she had done and why, her desperate need to matter, to contribute, to be more than decorative. He understood that need, even as he could not excuse the betrayal. When he returned to London, rain had begun falling again, steady and relentless. The city looked gray and tired, matching his mood perfectly. He went directly to his study, sat in the worn leather chair his mother had once occupied, and made a decision. He sent for Camilla. She arrived within minutes, moving slowly, as though afraid of what awaited her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by weeks of isolation and regret. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. When she met his gaze, he saw fear mixed with desperate hope. "Sit, please," he said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She obeyed, hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for whatever judgment he would deliver. Charles took a long breath before speaking. "The estate will remain unsold. It belongs to the crown and will stay that way. Your authority regarding royal finances and properties will remain limited. Those decisions are not negotiable." Her face crumpled slightly, but she nodded, accepting the terms. Without argument, however, he continued, his voice softening despite himself. "I do not wish to continue living as strangers. What you did was wrong. It broke my trust in ways I am still trying to understand, but I remember who you are beyond this mistake. I remember everything we have survived together." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Charles, I am so sorry. I never meant I know." Interrupted gently, "I know you did not intend this outcome, but intentions do not erase consequences. We must find a way to move forward that acknowledges both, the pain you caused and the love that still exists despite it." She nodded again, unable to speak through tears that had been building for weeks. "This forgiveness comes not from the king to his queen," Charles said carefully, "but from a husband to his wife. In private, we are still us. In public, boundaries must remain until trust rebuilds. Do you understand?" "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." They sat together in silence as rain continued its endless percussion against windows. The palace remained quiet around them, holding its breath. Two people bound by the crown yet scarred by pride, trying to find their way back to each other across a distance measured not in steps but in broken trust, slowly mending.